The movie takes place in Silver Creek, Colorado, and at the start, famous author Paul Sheldon finishes his latest book, which is still called Untitled. Paul is the writer of a popular series of romance books set in the Victorian era. Chastain drives home after finishing the book, but a snowstorm causes him to lose control of the car and swerve off the road, breaking his legs and dislocating his shoulder. In a flashback, Paul is talking to his publishing agent Marcia Sindel, who scolds him for killing off the main character in his latest book, Misery's Child. Paul says that if he hadn't killed Misery, he would have spent his whole life writing about her. He also says that he's going to Colorado to finish the new book. Back in the present, Paul is knocked out and saved by Annie Wilkes, a former nurse who lives just outside of Silver Creek. She takes him to a remote home and nurses him back to health with her nursing skills, food, and a stash of codeine-based painkillers while feeding him soup. If he says anything about how much she likes the book but doesn't like how often profanity is used, she loses it and spills his soup, but she quickly gets over it and apologizes. Buster and his wife Virginia are driving down the same road that Paul was driving before he crashed. Eventually, they come across a tree with a broken branch. Buster goes down the hill to look around, but when he sees that the car is completely covered in snow, he turns around and drives by them as they get back in the car to go to the newspaper office. Annie shows Paul the copy of Misery's Child that she bought. When Paul asks about roads, Annie says that only the road into town is open. She says she called the hospital and told them about Paul and what happened, as well as the agent. When Paul asks if Annie's phone works, Annie says that hers is still broken. Paul is worried about his daughter and the fact that it is her birthday. He says that the publisher will tell his daughter that he is fine. As Annie reads the book, she praises Paul for feeding him well and introducing him to her pet pig, Misery. At one point, she tells Paul that after her husband left her, she went to work at the hospital where she first met Misery. After reading the book, Annie finds out that Misery died in childbirth, and she gets so angry that she almost hits Paul. As she's getting ready to leave, she tells Paul that she didn't contact the doctors, his agent, or his family, and no one knows where he is. She also tells him that if something bad happens to her, the next day, Buster writes an article about Paul's disappearance in the newspaper. He calls Marcia, but she says that no one has seen or heard from Paul. Meanwhile, Virginia is on the other line telling Buster that she ran a credit check on Paul Sheldon. His last credit card transaction was when he paid his bill at the Silver Creek Lodge. Buster comes back the next morning and helps Paul get back into bed. Marcia apologizes for leaving him and says she's sorry. Annie sprays lighter fluid on his bed, and after some hesitation, Paul sets fire to his work. After that, a helicopter carrying Buster, who is looking for Paul, flies over and hands Paul his pain medication before leaving with the charred remains of the manuscript. Paul then starts to hide his pain medication and sets up a small table, brings in a typewriter and says that Paul will write a new book called Misery's Return that will bring a character back from the dead. She also says that the book will be written in her honor because she saved his life and nursed him back to health. But when Paul says that she bought paper that leaves smudges, Annie gets angry and slams the paper on his lap, which hurts him a lot. She scolds him even more and storms out. He knocks a ceramic penguin off the table as he walks through the living room. He catches it, but then turns it around so it faces the other way. He finds a small closet with dozens of novel sample boxes and takes one. He can't get his wheelchair through a door in the kitchen, so he has to crawl to it. When he gets there, he finds that the door is locked, and he sees a set of knives. When he hears Annie's car, Buster says that Paul did not climb out of bed and comes to the conclusion that someone back in bed pulled him out. Paul makes a small pocket out of a piece of paper from Annie's pad of paper, and then he starts writing the book. He thinks Annie will kill him if he doesn't, but she rejects his first attempt, comparing it to a cliffhanger from her childhood called Rocket Man. He tries again, and this time she likes it and says she'll put it on her Liberace records. Paul invites Annie to dinner, and she says yes. In the meantime, Buster has bought several Misery novels, saying that if he can't find Paul, he can read about what he has written. Paul suggests that he and Annie raise a glass to Misery during dinner. He sends Annie to find a candle and poisons her wine with pill powder while she is gone. When she returns and lights the candle, they start the toast. But Annie knocks over the candle and spills her poison wine while trying to pick it up. She apologizes profusely, pours more wine on the poison wine, and they toast. Paul is sad, but he keeps writing. Annie reads the finished chapters to Liberace's Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1. As he finishes each chapter and fills in the missing parts, Annie is thrilled with what he's done and begs him to tell her how it ends, but he politely refuses. Annie comes in one night feeling sad and tells Paul how much she loves him and doesn't want to lose him. Paul asks her why he would want to lose her, and she tells him that the book is almost done, his legs are getting better, and he would want to leave. Paul says he likes it there, but if anyone thinks he's lying, she pulls out a gun and says she's thinking about using it. While she's gone, Paul sneaks out of his room and gets a knife from the kitchen to kill Annie. On his way back, he finds a scrapbook full of newspaper clippings that suggest she is a serial killer. When she was a maternity nurse, she was accused of killing several babies and put on trial, but the case was thrown out because there wasn't enough evidence. Paul then goes back to his room and lies down in bed. He puts the knife in the sling around his arm and waits for Annie to come home. When she does, she goes upstairs and starts watching TV. Paul hides the knife under the mattress and goes to sleep. During the night, Annie gives Paul a hypodermic injection and ties him to the bed. When he wakes up, she tells him that she knows he left the room because of the ceramic penguin. Buster goes to the library and looks through an old newspaper storybook. He finds stories about the baby deaths and Annie's trial and a quote she gave the reporters from a misery novel that he had written down. He goes to the general store and talks to the owner Pete, who tells him that Annie has bought a lot of typing paper. Buster thinks Paul is at the Wilkes farm and drives there. Annie injects Paul again and hides him in a tree. Paul sneaks in a can of charcoal lighter fluid. While Paul is finishing the book, he tells Annie that he needs a cigarette, a match, and a glass of champagne. Annie knows about and wants to start this tradition. When she gives Paul these things, he says they need a second glass for her, so she goes to get the second glass. When Annie comes back, Paul is so happy that he soaks the manuscript in lighter fluid and sets it on fire in front of her. As she tries to put out the fire, she puts the typewriter on her head. Paul and Annie get into a fight, and Paul puts the burning pages in Annie's mouth. She gets up to go to him, but Paul trips her, and she hits her head on the typewriter, knocking her out cold. Paul crawls out of the room, but Annie wakes up and tries to get him back in. He grabs a pig-shaped door stopper and hits her in the head, killing her. A few months later, Paul is in New York City, using a cane to get around. He has a new book called The Higher Education of J. Philip Stone. Marcia says that critics have been saying good things about it and that it might win some awards. Marcia suggests that he write a nonfiction book about his time with Annie Wilkes still. Paul says no because it's clear that his experiences have left him with psychological damage. He often has nightmares and hallucinations of people coming to get him for revenge. Paul sees that Annie is shocked when he says this, but it's just a dream because the waitress tells Paul she's a big fan. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this.